Today, how to fix Australia. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news. Unfortunately, Edwin is unable to join me today, Monday. He's lost his voice. Hopefully, we'll get him back later in the week. But this gives me an opportunity to play a recent show that I recorded with Alex over at Nuggets News, where we discuss some of the deep issues that we need to consider if we want to fix Australia. So enjoy, and I hope to catch up with Edwin later in the week.
Hi guys, thanks for tuning into another episode of Nuggets News. Well, we've got a very special episode tonight with Martin, who we usually do our regular monthly housing and economy update. But tonight we're going to be talking about how do we save Australia, all the proposed changes that you or I might do, Martin, or look to put to politicians and so on, and talk about how we got in this mess and how we can fix it from one of the best countries, and still I think one of the best countries if it wasn't so poorly run.
Well, it is interesting because I do think that Australia has the best foundations on which to build a hugely prosperous future. And yet we seem to have stuffed it up so majorly over several generations of bad policy decisions, I think. And now, of course, ordinary Australians and businesses are really scratching their heads saying, well, I don't see the benefit of all of the stuff that's been going on. So, yeah, can we find a way forward? And I think that's a really important conversation to have.
And I guess we don't want to be doom and gloom, but people are noticing that the living standards have been going down. And I think the global elite that are pulling the strings now, that sit above our politicians with the decision making of these non-government organisations and even higher up and deeper levels, they are incrementally taking away our freedoms at 1 or 2% a year. So the average person doesn't really notice it. You hear people talk about the good old days, and it's time for people to start thinking, well, why was that? And some every now and then we have a year or an incident like COVID, which probably takes away more than 1 or 2% of your freedoms very quickly, or inflation, the money printing that seems to erode more of your wealth at a faster pace than that. But I think this is the basic idea for people to understand, that this is almost a programmed taking away of your freedoms, your wealth. We'll get into maybe some health stuff as well. But the reality is that things are getting worse every year for the average Aussie and for many countries around the world that are facing a similar playbook and destruction from those in charge.
Yeah, and I think that the key point to understand is this is intentional. This isn't just an happenstance. This isn't just something which is, trying to respond to events. People will say, well, it was COVID that created it. It was the global financial crisis which created it. No. There is an intent here which has been building for quite a long period of time. And the overall architecture is firstly to continue to increase the amount of debt in the system. We've always, in our monthly shows, talk about the amount of debt that's building. And that's public debt as well as private debt. And so we have a system that's built on ever more debt. We've got a system that is basically giving people less and less freedom rather than more and more freedom. And as you say, those freedoms have been eroded incrementally over time. And, now you will have to log in and prove your identity if you want to do a Google search in Australia as the latest. But more broadly, the whole concept of free speech and being able to express ideas and opinions is something which is actually being questioned now. And rather than having robust debates about the way the economy is tracking and what's going on, it's getting harder and harder to have some of those conversations. And politicians are a bit frightened, I think, to really admit some of the truths. So if you go back through the last election cycle, there was almost no discussion about the big debt that we've got in Australia, the deficits that are running wall to wall. And then, of course, we had the ABC release this week where they got that through the FOI, and it proved that the Treasury advice was, we have a problem. And so there's this gap between the inferred reality from what the politicians are saying and the true reality that actually many people are experiencing. And for me, this is a really important angle to understand. Reality is being warped by people who actually have an intent to take reality away from us.
Yeah, and we have to ask ourselves the question, well, the politicians, what extent do they know exactly what they're doing versus what they're saying? And they're being told to meet these global UN, WEF goals, Agenda 2030 and all this nonsense. Or are some of them, blackmailed, like we've seen with this whole, the Epstein saga and all this stuff that's coming out about how much leverage and the games that some of these intelligence agencies and elites play to get what they want and push this agenda ever forward as well.
Yeah, and I think there is this neoliberal idea underneath all of this, which is let the markets be the markets. You can't do anything to upset the markets. The markets are actually, the religion which is driving absolutely everything. And you can look at that through the financial system with the banks still doing extremely well. Look at the valuation of CBA at the moment. Now we've got the military complex, industrial military complex, saying, "Ha, you got to spend more on defence." So of course, those are all booming. And so we have this absurd situation where at one end of the spectrum, we have large and powerful organizations across a number of different sectors calling the shots. I would argue that in many cases, they're actually almost holding politicians, at bay as well, and saying, unless you do this, we're not going to do that sort of thing. Or the gas industry in Australia, which is having a huge impact on the energy. So you've got these large organizations, very powerful organizations, often international organizations, who are really calling the shots. And then you've got these quasi non-governmental organizations like the UN and the World Economic Forum, and I could go and list a whole bunch of people who actually have a completely different understanding of the way the world works, because it's again informed by this neoliberal view. It's informed by this idea that the levers we have to pull are in the best interest of everybody, but they're making decisions in the best interest of the few rather than the many. And I come back to this fundamental problem that I see again and again in my surveys and elsewhere, is that all of the levers that are being pulled under the neoliberal banner are benefiting a small number of very affluent people and groups at the expense of everybody else. Now, if you talk to people like Michael Hudson, of course, he will say, well, it's always been like that. If you look at the Greeks, and if you look at the Romans, and if you look at earlier in history, it's always been the debt slaves that effectively are there to support the elite. So in a way, everything's changed, but in another way, nothing has changed.
Yeah, I agree that it's always been that way. That doesn't mean it's the right way.
No.
And I think for people to understand how we make changes, we need to understand where these elites and these people in charge are pushing us. And it's becoming very obvious for these things we've been talking about for years now, that they want to push us towards a control grid, digital surveillance, central bank digital currency, AI, carbon credit scores. You won't be able to travel, you won't be able to eat meat, all this type of thing. And more people are waking up to the fact that this isn't a conspiracy. It's ultimately they want people that just live in these tiny little box apartments in 15-minute cities, like we've basically seen these huge cities in China already. You don't really have any freedoms. You don't get to go out in nature, all this type of thing. So this is right on our doorstep in the next few years if we don't wake people up in time. So once you understand where this is all going, you can start to understand why it's happening. And it's easier for them to do this if they do things like flood us with immigrants, divide us on every issue, race, religion, break down the family structure, break down the gender structure. Just if everyone is busy infighting on all these little issues, and I think that's probably a take-home message from me tonight, is people have to understand that, the unity. You go to a kid's birthday party on the weekend, doesn't matter what race or background or religion the parents are from, they're all happy if they're playing at the park and their kids are all playing together. All this division comes from the propaganda and the programming of the system and of the elites.
Yeah, and there's a thing called misdirection. It's used by magicians, right? So when they're actually performing a trick, they want you to look over there while they're doing something over here, right? And I actually believe that there is a lot of misdirection at the moment going on. So effectively, there's a lot of noise. The Voice last year was a classic example in my mind of spending a lot of time on, this was an important issue, but it wasn't the critical issue, and yet it got way too much coverage. And so what we need to do is to understand what the landscape really is like, not actually just look at the tricks and look at the flashy bits, which the politicians want you to look at. And it's interesting, when I talk to politicians, quite a few of them privately will admit the system is badly broken and that actually democracy isn't really working that well at the moment. Look at the last election. We got a massive landslide on 1/3 of the votes. And so there are some big structural questions. But let's come back to sort of a fundamental point, Alex, which is, what is the economy and society for, right? Because I think this is a really important point. And at the moment, under the neoliberal view, society and the economy is ultimately there to make a small number of people really wealthy. That's what it's about. It's about wealth perpetuation to a small proportion. Now, I would argue that there is a very different way of thinking about society and the economy. And to me, society and economy is about maximizing the benefit and maximizing the opportunity for everybody. Now, there is a fundamentally different set of things that you would do if you had that as your intent, rather than actually being wedded to the neoliberal view of maximizing the wealth of a few.
I completely agree. And you look at happiness studies and things like that, where there's plenty of places throughout Asia. A lot of people move into Bali, Indonesia, where if you have your basics met, the food, water, shelter, you can get out in nature, get some sunshine, all that type of thing. I think people are starting to rethink what it means, because they can't get those basics met here, particularly in the cities now. It is just insane, the cost of living, where you can catch a plane a few hours somewhere else and have a completely better life. And people are starting to ask those questions, and we're seeing it all the time. Influencers talking about how they've left Australia and that type of thing. But obviously, that's not an option for everyone. I think more and more people are going to choose to move rurally and out of cities. And I think cities are always the first places to tend to boil over for a number of reasons. But I think it frustrates me that Australia has all these resources, all this land, but it's just all the red tape and bureaucracy that prevents us from having a great nation. So do you want to start to we'll tackle some of those, Martin, about the extent of foreign ownership of our resources versus other countries that have done it well with sovereign wealth funds? It's all just because the small number of people can make these decisions. It's crazy.
Well, let's start with the energy conundrum, because of course an economy needs relatively inexpensive energy to thrive and survive. And we have a massive issue in Australia where, because of bad policy decisions over 30, 40 years now, what we have is the highest energy costs in the world. And that is because of the fact that the gas prices that we pay, remember that we are exporting more gas overseas than we're actually using in Australia from that within the Australian realm, as it were. So we have a small number of large multinational gas corporations who are basically taking the gas out of the ground, using some of the gas to liquefy it, sending it offshore, and then ultimately charging us full international prices. Those full international prices then translate, because of the way that the energy system works, to the marginal price of electricity, which means we have the highest gas prices and the highest electricity prices in the world, which is absolutely nonsensical, right? Because we should be like one of those Middle Eastern countries who are the oil producers and have very cheap oil. So if we actually had a different approach to energy and actually had a baseline energy cost which was in line with the cost of producing the energy in the first place, that would give Australia a huge advantage. And the point here, Alex, is that the government could do this. The government could do this with a stroke of a pen, just by reserving gas for Australian use rather than actually allowing it all to be exported overseas. Now, people will say, sovereign risk. No. There is still plenty of gas there for that international exportation as well, if you want to do that. But we have to fix energy pricing in Australia. Why? Because it's a huge impost on households, but more importantly, it's an impossible impost on businesses. So businesses are closing left, right, and centre. They have been for the last 20 years or so, because energy costs are way too high. So one of the issues that I would tackle if I was thinking about how to solve this problem is to recognise that energy is a key foundational issue for us in Australia. And it's not directly connected to net zero, although it is a bit. But the real issue is those large international gas corporations are taking us to the cleaners. We should have a sovereign fund like Norway had, right? Where they use the proceeds from the oil industry to build wealth for the future. We didn't do that in Australia.
I mean, look at in Libya before they overthrew Gaddafi, because he was giving all the resource wealth to the people, free healthcare, free education. I think petrol was 5 cents a litre.
Yep.
All these things that the big bankers and the big oil cartels hate, and they come in and they, overthrow, assassinate you or whatever. People have to wake up to this is the type of stuff that is going on, and if more people are awake to it, we can start to stop this. But yeah, I agree. I also think it's nonsensical when you look at the tiny fraction. Even if you whether or not you believe in the emission stuff, like it's just so insignificant what Australia's doing compared to what China is doing. And we ship everything over there so they can manufacture it, and then we import it back. Like, it's passing the buck in that regard. But also, I think uranium, we did an episode years ago about Fukushima and how that kind of was one of those mass tragedy events where people just got programmed to think that nuclear was bad and unsafe and unreliable. But there's hundreds of nuclear reactors that have been operating safely for decades. Plenty of countries are rolling out more and more of them. And then now with all this boom in AI and tech, the big money goes, oh, we're going to need a lot more power. We're going to start funding nuclear. After governments have been saying, it's not possible, it's not plausible, it's not safe for years, as soon as the big money wants it, they kind of get it. So yeah, I kind of agree that we want to try and maybe phase out dirtier fuels like coal and that because of air quality and that. But I also don't buy into this, the carbon is the issue and human climate change, and we're going to, I think the climate has changed heaps over centuries or millennia or whatever, naturally up and down. I don't think the tiny little bit of emissions that we're doing one way or another has a great effect in the grand scheme of things. And I think what we've also seen is moving to these renewables is so unreliable and unsteady for the grid that it can't meet demand and ends with more power outages. And as you say, it's just a disaster in places that are doing it. So that's my bit of a rant about energy, Martin. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I have a certain degree of confidence in the science, which suggests that things are changing. As to why they're changing, that is very much less clear. But what we do know is that the consequences from the decisions that have been taken over the last 20 to 30 years in Australia is to put the price of energy out of the ballpark for many people. And, I keep coming back to look at households, look at businesses. We need to find a different route for energy and a different price point for energy. And my point is, the government could do this, and it could do it immediately. So for me, this is an immediate fix, right? There is still a broader issue about, the future of energy. I do think we need more baseline energy, baseload energy, and I think that nuclear is something which is definitely appropriate to think about. And of course, Australia is blessed with, guess what? Large amounts of uranium. So why don't we start exploiting that?
The thing that I don't like about the, demonizing carbon so much and making this carbon credits and all this type of stuff that we know is coming is, firstly, the big corporations don't make any changes to their activities. They buy and offset carbon credits that are issued by BlackRock or ETFs. It's all just a big fugazi. The real problem is the pollution and air quality and pesticides and all these toxins that are going into the environment. And none of the big companies are talking about that. They're saying, oh, it's carbon. And I agree that the climate is probably changing, but there's been plenty of times throughout history where it's been plenty warmer and plenty colder and that type of thing. And I just think you look at the makeup of the atmosphere, and there's plenty of thousands of scientists out there that are saying it's not really man-made, that's not really the issue, and this carbon credit is all just another system of control and a distraction to enslave people and make people feel guilty about eating a steak or running their heater or driving their car to enslave people.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I'd also make the point, there was a recent report that showed that there was a rise in cancers among younger people in Australia. And, there are some things that you've got to ask about, well, why is that, right? And I think that things like what the air quality is and what the quality of the food that we're eating is and what medicines we are, by accident or by design, consuming is all part of a question about the way that we live. and the way that big corporations are actually feeding us. And I get very cross personally with this idea of you've got big pharma saying, hey, we'll give you drugs that can make you slim. And you've got big food saying, we'll sell you more stuff, and it won't be very good quality stuff, and it'll have lots of, chemicals in it. So you've almost got this yin and the yang again, using people as cannon fodder. And for me, you got to actually ask some really deep questions about the nature of within which we live, the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, and all of those things. And for me, this is, again, something which is not actually really being discussed, I think, adequately. And for me, this is really important. And once again, we are being blindsided by a lot of rubbish, particularly in the mainstream media about this. There is some really important stuff here to be asked.
Yeah, and this is my passion as well, Martin, being an ex-pharmacist and realizing that none of these medications behind the shelf, if you exclude emergency medicine and you're in a car crash and you need surgery and x-rays and modern technology, no pill is actually going to ever heal you and get to the root cause of these problems. And the problems have all arisen from this modern society that we live in, where we're not eating natural food anymore. Everything's sprayed with pesticides, herbicides, it's genetically modified. Bill Gates has now got this appeal coating certified to put on organic foods. It's just, nothing is the way it was in nature. And is it any wonder we're getting sick? Our supermarkets are full of sugar and refined carbohydrates and seed oils and all this crap that wasn't really ever in our diet that much for thousands of years. And so when you add that up with, we're not getting enough sunlight, people aren't exercising enough, water and fluoride, all the pesticides in the water now, it's coming at you from every angle, as well as there's plenty of leading oncologists in Australia now seeing that the rise of cancer being tied to, the mRNA vaccine and this type of thing, which more and more people are kind of waking up to. So I think it's this complete rejig where people can say, oh, that's all conspiracy. But at some point when you have 1 in 2 people getting cancer, 1 in 30 kids with autism or ADD, 1 in 2 people obesity, 1 in 2 people mental health issues, like at what point do we say that maybe it's time to radically think that, yeah, everything we're doing is causing all of this? Because all of this was really rare before mass industrialization and these big companies that put profit first over people took over, which I guess was really in the 60s, wasn't it, when it really ramped up that industrialization?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I did an interview some time ago with a lady from the UK who's been studying some of the issues here. And she said, look, what we've got is we've got the privatization of a lot of this stuff. So years ago, people would be concerned about some of those issues, but now it's become it's your problem, not our problem. If somebody has obesity, it's your problem rather than it's our problem. So, well, what we're actually getting to is effectively the privatization of all of these issues, rather than actually understanding this is a societal issue, right? This is driven by the structure of society, the way things work, the way that large companies work, and the fact is we're not getting full information about the harmful effects of some of the stuff that is just normal course of business at the moment. And that, for me, is a major concern. And I agree, look at sugar and look at the way that sugar was, for a long time, regarded as fine. It's fat that's the problem, it's not sugar. Whereas now people are realizing that sugar is actually a real part of the big part of the problem. And the fact that, exercise and how much exercise people does is important too. So somehow we've lost the plot here. And then we've got, again, I come back to Big Pharma saying, oh, we can solve that by giving you more pills, right? So effectively you privatize it and then you actually start giving people more pills to sort of try and solve it. No. There are societal and structural issues here that actually need to be thought through quite differently from the way that currently it's being thought about.
Yeah, and that was the big one for me, tying it all together when I first kind of woke up to all this in my pharmacy days, that the same people that own the big food companies that are pumping you full of sugar and whatever own the big pharma companies. And now it's becoming clear that, the BlackRocks of the world and all that, they want you sick. They want to pump you full of sugar so you get diabetes because they make a heap of money off the insulin. And it's just this big circle of life where the last thing they want is taking independent, sovereignty over your own body and your health, and being 100% healthy, never getting sick, and never being a subscription customer to Big Pharma for the rest of your life. So I think more and more people are realizing that going natural and just getting back to those ways that we did things for plenty of years when everyone was pretty healthy. We had low rates of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, all these things that have now, they've somehow normalized this. And whether that's telling people it's just genetic or trying to make it acceptable and all that type of thing in the movies and fashion industry or whatever, but it's not healthy. We want people to be healthy and happy.
And it's interesting, if you look back in the Second World War in Europe and in the UK, where food was harder to come by and people had to grow their own, and actually the rates of illness were a lot lower. And I think that's a really interesting observation. So actually, a lot of this is to do with lifestyle and what you do and what you don't do and what you put in your body and what you don't put in your body. And for me, that's an important observation, because I think there is an ownership issue for individuals, but it's quite hard for individuals if you're part of this societal structure that basically is being thrown stuff left, right, and center, and all the adverts that are on TV and social media and everything else. So it's almost like we're being cajoled into consuming more and consuming more and consuming more, and then reaping the circumstances of that. So again, it's waking up, I think, and thinking about it. And you could actually argue this is precisely the same in the context of housing too, right? So you are a cash flow, effectively, to big corporations. You are a cash flow, so they're interested in getting you to pay and to continue paying and to continue paying through your life. And that's true of food, it's true of pharma, it's true of your mortgage as well. And so one of the other things that we're seeing is more and more people getting more and more mortgage. Why? Because house prices are so high. Why are house prices so high? Because the banks have effectively been allowed to lend a lot more, which has put more upward pressure on housing. The debt bomb has continued to grow. That debt bomb has allowed prices to continue to rise. That means the banks can lend more. And so we're seeing longer duration mortgages and more of household incomes going on the mortgage too. So housing is exhibiting precisely the same symptoms as we've been talking about as well. So this is, again, another example of the mega trend here, which is worth understanding.
Well, let's dive into housing a little bit more. But before we do, I just want to tie up the food thing just for people with the solutions. So obviously more and more people are shopping at their local farmers markets, their local butchers. When you see things like Bill Gates products and whatever in the supermarket, don't buy them. And the supermarkets will stop stocking these things when they see, what's the other one? The Bovier with the cow farts that Bill Gates is now pushing. If you see that coming into your dairy supply and your meat supplier, and the brands that it's in, stop buying them and vote with your wallet. Ideally, if you can grow your own food and have plants in your house to grow even a few berries and stuff like that, start doing those things. But really, if more and more people go into the farmers market, they plant more the next year. And we have to decentralize the food industry, because the way it's going, no country, I don't think, is more monopolized or duopolized with Coles and Woolies. And the farmers getting paid what the markets dictate. We need to go back to those grassroots level where everyone is growing and trading, producing locally and that type of thing, rather than continue to support these supermarkets that are going down this path of, it's profit driven, the same as everywhere else.
And just to round that out, processed foods are everywhere, right? So when you look at the ingredient lists on foods, just look at all of those extra ingredients that are actually not actually adding anything other than bulk or sugar or emulsifiers. All of that, that doesn't need to be there, right? So changing the way that you eat and what you eat, get those raw materials, be they vegetables or meats or whatever, and roll your own, as it were. Doesn't take a lot longer than actually getting something direct from the supermarket that's already been reconstructed several times and contains a whole lot of nasties. So it is about changing your approach and your lifestyle. And I come back to that point again. It's back to you making different decisions.
Well, people are familiar with fiat currency and governments printing more and it getting debased. But in the crypto world, we kind of call it fiat food, because these packagings that they're pumping full of, whatever, soy and fillers and emulsifiers and whatever, you've got to remember that the actual food it's originally based on is real food and nutrients, and they're just debasing the food supply. And you look at the middle of the supermarket, that 90% that come in, packets and boxes, it's just full of crap that is void of nutrients. So you want to be just eating whole foods that come from nature. It's pretty simple. Yeah,
absolutely. And just they also pump it full of water as well. So, you ought to be a little bit careful, because you can end up buying 20%, 30%, 4% water, which is, of course, a very cheap ingredient. So.
Yeah, and then they're going to try and 3D print vegetable meat and all this type of stuff they're trying to push on us as well now. But moving on, Martin. So what would we do to rejig the sort of banking system and loan system? There's talk about the Australia Post Bank, but I guess my thoughts are we should almost have a multiple tiered system. So if someone is a first homeowner, they should be paying a pretty low interest rate compared to someone that is borrowing more to buy their second, third, their 10th property, until everyone's basic needs are met in terms of the average person, the average Aussie on an average wage. If they can't afford a house, as an investor, you don't get to buy your 10th property. I think we need to start looking at radical changes. Well, you can buy your 10th property, but you're going to be paying a lot more tax until everyone's basic needs are met. The Australia Post idea of a bank that actually lends for real businesses and real mortgage lending.
Yeah, so I think three principles. The first is somewhere to live is a human right, not just because you can afford to pay more than somebody else, right? So that we got to change that philosophy. The second is there is a fundamental difference between owning a property to live in and owning a property for investment returns. And at the moment, we've messed this up, not least because, of course, the government has completely outsourced the rental sector to the private sector. And that means that you've got this deadly embrace of two different imperatives going in different directions. The first is to maximize your investment return, which means putting the rent up as much as you can, and the cost of living. The third is, of course, that currently, if you compare the amount of income relative to the costs for housing, it's gone through the roof. And that's because of 30 to 50 years of bad policy. Supply and demand, well, demand is too high. We need to dial back migration to be able to, just take the edge off the future demand for property. And then from a supply side, we definitely need to build more and better quality houses. That doesn't mean high rise. That doesn't mean low cost, build to rent solutions. It needs a different way of thinking about property. But fundamentally, you're right. We have to look at the financial aspect of this. I actually think that we should not want to continue to see property prices to grow in real terms relative to incomes. Now, that's a tough thing for people to actually come to, but actually it's the right answer, right? So the first thing is we should say, no, we don't expect prices to continue to grow. Incomes need to actually come back into equilibrium. Secondly, if you've got a massive portfolio of investment properties, then absolutely you should be getting more of a break on that through the tax system rather than an accelerator on the tax system through the gearing processes you have. And the third is that first-time buyers, they need a leg up, but you've got to be careful because with first-time buyer incentives that we've had so far, what we've done is just pumped prices higher. So there has to be a different structure to the way we incentivize first-time buyers to be able to get into the property market and stay in the property market. And we also need to be thinking about what the right level of returns is through the financial system. And I agree, a public bank is part of this. If you were to take out the profit element, that would make a huge difference. And it's interesting, I noticed that in the insurance sector, Tasmania is now talking about having a public insurer, and that's great because what it means is that the insurances will be lower in cost relative to currently. Because when you wire in the profit motive in all of this, you end up essentially with everybody saying, well, we'll charge as much as we can charge. And that's why prices have risen. That's why the costs for households have risen. So we need to think structurally different. So there's some tax levers there. There's some migration levers there. There's some supply levers there. And there's some other financial incentives that we need to bring in too, because I believe that owning a property and living in a property is a human right rather than actually just for the exclusive few.
Yeah, and think about it. If you have nationalized banks, guys, the idea is that rather than private companies making billions, you know, it's seen as a basic human right, and those billions are returned back into the pockets of everyday Australians. It's a pretty simple concept.
Mm.
And once again, we get back to this idea of decentralization because everything's become so monopolized, and the local branch where the manager knows you and you can go in with your business idea and that type of thing. And it's the same when we propose the idea that maybe the investor should own 10 houses if the average person can't afford one. These things just wouldn't happen if we were all in these community kind of setups. Yeah, if you go back to the grassroots example, you're not going to have one wealthy guy owning 20 houses on the street while the average 19 people can't afford. It gets back to these ethics and that type of thing. So yeah, I think that more and more people, with all the big banks closing all these branches, it's like everything. It's just, I feel they're preparing us for this mass centralization and for AI to start governing everything from, banking and finance to politics and legislation, decision making.
Yes, and I think that takes us interestingly on to the digital control question, right? Because if you look carefully at what's happened, we are having our whole lives controlled more and more by big tech, and okay, a lot of it's US related, but not only US related. The way that government interacts with us is more online now. And we keep getting digital leaks. Look at Qantas, that's the risk when everything's digitalized, the security risks that are rising. But more importantly, it's about control and it's about compliance. And, if you don't do the right things, then you won't be able to do whatever you want to do. And suddenly you find that your money is no longer accessible to you. And all of those things follow from that. So there's a really important issue here about ownership of your own data rather than just allowing it to be flooded around all over the place, and also your own financial footprint and controlling that and managing it more effectively, and not playing the game of the big tech and not playing the game of big government where effectively, control is it. You touched on the central bank digital currency, you touched on that earlier on as well. This is all part of a puzzle that we don't want to participate in. I think we need to actually make sure that we don't just get sucked up in this to the point where we just become a digit.
Yeah, well, the banks have come out recently and said if you say mean things online, they can shut down your accounts. And, I had all my Commonwealth Bank accounts I'd had since kindergarten shut down last year when I started doing more controversial stuff on Twitter and on YouTube. And you go into your local branch where you know the person and they say, we can't give you a reason other than it's come down from head office. And this is one of these things where you can't get a support person on the phone at these big companies like Facebook and whatever. If we keep going to this world where the big companies, and you spoke about the power prices and everything else that's killing small business, this is part of their plan to eventually have one food company, one central bank digital currency. It's just going to be one of everything, and there's no support hotline you can call for help or anything. It's just bad luck. And so this is why we talk about Bitcoin or gold. And a lot of people don't like either of them, and maybe neither of them are perfect. But in this world, compared to central bank digital currency, getting your accounts frozen for, going to a protest with facial recognition cameras in cities now, all this is already happening across different parts of the world. It's going to come to Australia in the next few years. So as you say, things like using a VPN when they go to this digital age verification in December, I think it's meant to kick in, isn't it? So we'll be doing more episodes on that. But as you say, we just have to protect our privacy, our data, our freedoms, and have a plan, get ahead of it before they, make this stuff almost impossible to obtain and get your money out of the banks into gold or Bitcoin or that type of thing.
Absolutely. And I think that leads quite nicely into another angle, and that is think about the way the political system is working at the moment or not working, right? We have effectively a uni party who basically think very close to what the opposition thinks. The last election showed that. But the small voice, the opposition voice, the people with alternative views, they got stifled because of the way that the digital platforms worked and because of the lack of coverage in the mainstream media. So we don't really have full democracy in Australia at the moment. And that's a real problem too, because what it means is that effectively the government can direct almost what is said and what is discussed. And that's part of this same control mechanism as well. So we need to make sure that there is actually forums where ideas are expressed that you may not agree with, but you should at least listen to, because there's always an interesting counterpoint, an alternative viewpoint, which is really worth getting to. And so, to my mind, the political system and the dialogues and the digital are all connected.
Yeah, and I think more people have woken up to that two-party system. Left wing, right wing, same bird. And maybe if one gets in, they push a bit harder towards the certain policies that the globalists want, and then the other get back in, they push those other ones. But that's become clear for a lot of people. And I think this Saturday, the World Health Organization takes control of Australia's health policy. This is another example of centralisation that I've spoken about. And what is the point of having, healthcare professionals being able to make decisions for their patients and that type of thing if all that goes out the window? Because there are still some, good doctors and healthcare providers and nutritionists and people that are genuinely trying to help people. And all that goes out the window if they have another big, pandemic and say everyone's got to get this, or your money's going to be locked down if you're not up to date with your vaccine and all this stuff. They're probably going to push on us. And as you say, have these debates, but have them at the grassroots level. And more people that I talk to are starting to wake up to this stuff. And people that thought you were crazy for years, at the family function, now there's 3 or 4 of you that realise what's going on, and the rest of the family haven't woken up yet or whatever. But, speak your truth to people, and you'll be surprised how many people are like, yeah, I know what's going on. And I honestly think that sometimes the stuff that we see in terms of polls and that through the media, it's so hard to tell what's real and what's not. They might be saying, 90% of people, think that XYZ is a good thing, but there are these 90% of people don't. But unless people go out there and talk with each other, they don't actually know what the real sentiment is in the community and at the grassroots level, and the TV becomes their truth.
Well, I think social media as well. And look, the bottom line is that a lot of people know that things aren't right. A lot of people know that the way everything's running at the moment is not as it should be or could be, but they don't necessarily know what to do next. And so that's why it's important to have these conversations and just think differently about some of the issues that we've been touching on here, right? Because there are alternatives out there. There is an alternative approach which could take us to a very different future than what we've got at the moment, where there's a little bit more equality, where there's a little bit more focus on individuals and families and communities rather than the big corporates or, worse still, the big international players. But it is going to be based on individuals taking a different stance themselves. So to my mind, I've always believed it's a bottom-up rather than a top-down thing, right? And if you think that the way things are being imposed top-down at the moment, from Davos and below, the community up is the way to solve this. And so to my mind, it's very important for individuals and communities to really start asking some tougher questions.
100%. So maybe wrapping up a bit, Martin, what's sort of like the big things you would do if you're Prime Minister? We've spoken about nationalising, these big energy companies that are now all foreign owned and completely extorting Australia for its resources, nationalising the banking system, restoring freedom of speech, particularly on social media, to get these messages out. Dropping taxes. Once people actually understand how the monetary system works, there's no need for anyone to pay tax. The government can spend and get it back through, the different means to actually taxing these big companies rather than individual citizens I'm talking about. I think we need outcome-based healthcare. I think doctors only got paid if they made people healthy rather than put them on a pill for the rest of their life. All of a sudden, look at the savings that would have for government rather than all this money that we're wasting now on NDIS and the support workers, and just this flooding of this acceptance that it's okay to do nothing and earn a heap of money from the government while the few taxpayers pay for that type of stuff. So we've spoken about nuclear energy. What are your other big radical changes, Martin, that you'd love to see to turn this country around?
Well, just to re-emphasize the gas reservation system that needs to be blown up immediately, and that could be done tomorrow, right? I do believe that we need to change the thinking about futures of house prices. Just going up forever is not feasible. Government shouldn't be promising to prices should always go up. We should actually be looking to manage that, and sideways or down slightly would be very favourable. I think it's also very important that we think about what life is for, right? And I come back to a couple of simple observations. Do you work to live, or do you live to work? And at the moment, I know from my surveys that people feel it's like a treadmill where the only reason to work is to survive. And I actually think that's the wrong way around. So the other thing I'd be thinking about is thinking about who do we value, what do we value, and making sure that we've actually got a bit of a better balance here. And by the way, I'd also question significantly some of the recent commitments for international defence, like AUKUS. That's a massive waste of money, in my view. And I think I would take some of the money that was earmarked for AUKUS and invest it in building better locally in Australia. And then the final point I would say is that we need to make sure that the political system is fit for purpose and our treasury function is fit for purpose. And the Treasury is the worst of the worst at the moment. They are the neoliberal experts of all time. So I'd be looking for some significant change in the way that they think about. And it comes back to fundamentally what's important, right? So what is the purpose of society? What is the purpose of the economy? And to my mind, it comes back to this. We need strategies in place to maximize the benefit to ordinary people, not to the few. And I would fundamentally shift the levers around that end game.
Yeah, and politics should also be outcome based. If living standards go down and you don't meet what you run on, then you should be out and you shouldn't get these huge pensions. That stat that Albo is the highest paid politician in the world, where we've had the biggest drop in living standards in the world, shows you that this is kind of the system we're in. This is what they want. He is pushing the playbook the best by destroying our country. This is what the elites want. And finally, the big one we haven't spoken about a lot is immigration. But I think most people are waking up to what we've seen across Europe. Australia's been a pretty successful multicultural country because people come and they assimilate and they fit in and they want to work hard and just build a better, honest life for their family. And as I said before, nobody has a problem with any, I don't think, race, creed, or color if everyone's getting along and only wants the best for their family and an honest in a place to live and that type of thing. What we've seen across Europe, it's crystal clear in the stats. They've been flooded with immigrants. These traditional European Christian-based white countries have now become a minority in their own country. And now the other groups that have come in are getting privileges. And this is particularly obvious in the crime and the rapes and that we've seen skyrocket in the UK and across Europe, where it's these radicalized groups. And so there's no reason to be importing radicalized people from these different countries. Get the job skills shortages that you need. Sure thing, nobody has a problem with that. But while we're in a cost of living and housing crisis, it's insane to be importing the number of people that we do. And when people say refugees seeking asylum and that type of thing, you have to remember that if there's a billion people out there that are kind of seeking asylum, you can take 1 million here, 100,000 here, whatever. But these populations are growing at 5, 6, 7, 8%. So there's 50 million people the next year. So it doesn't matter which countries take 1 million here and there, unless you actually fix the root causes in those countries. All you're doing is bringing those problems here and decaying society. This is what we've started to see this year in the media with these machete attacks and violent crime and rapes. And then the judges let them off and say it's because they're frustrated because the country's different or they don't know any better. That is just, it's insane that we read these headlines and this is happening when any sane person would go, this just isn't right. If you're going to come here, you live by our standards and our rules. And if you do that, there's zero tolerance on that sort of violent, harsh crime. You either get deported or thrown in jail. Like it's a pretty no-brainer for me, Martin. But what are your thoughts on immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had dual-track thoughts about this. I do think that Australia has been very fortunate to have a very mixed cultural heritage. And, it's not perfect, but it's actually pretty amazing compared with many other countries around the world. And certainly if I look at European countries and the UK. It's not working very well at the moment for the reasons you said. But the reason really is that the average Australian or the average Brit is not feeling better off. They're feeling a lot worse off. And they feel that the system is not working for them, it's working against them. And I would suggest that some of the issues that we're seeing in the context of migration are actually because of the broader issues that we've been talking about, right? Which is, a function of too many people, a function also of the financial system not working for ordinary people, and the broader commercial issues we've touched on. So if you were actually to address some of the other issues that we've been talking about and change the atmospherics, I think you get a quite different outcome. But in the meantime, like I said, you need to right size the migration to the ability to supply places to live for them. And we're not doing that in Australia. Migration is still well too high. So it's got to be part of the mix. But I'm not sure that just dialing migration down to zero and expecting suddenly everything else to fix itself is realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that's not the sole cause for sure. But guys, I hope you've enjoyed that one at home. Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below, what you do to fix Australia. Is there anything we missed that you disagree with? We might do another one of these in future, Martin. But as you said, change has to come from the people on the grassroots level rather than letting this small number of people dictate the way this country is going. That's the same for everywhere across the world where we're heading in a bad direction.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is bottom up. It is people taking local accountability and wanting to make change and driving change. And boy, if enough people actually get on the bandwagon, the politicians will have to take notice.
Fantastic. Well, Martin, thanks for your time as always, and we'll talk to you again soon. Cheers.
See ya. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.